All right, good evening. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Institute of World Politics. We are a graduate school in national security and international affairs. I am Aaron Danis. I am an adjunct professor here in terrorism and counterterrorism. And I was asked to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Sean McFate, who's going to talk about his book, The Modern Mercenary, because we are colleagues at National Defense University. I'm not sure Sean would always admit that we're colleagues there, but we are colleagues there. And I wanted him to come and speak about this book because I thought it's just a fantastic read and a very timely topic. Sean is an expert on strategy, the future of warfare, and international relations. In addition to being at National Defense University, he is also at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an adjunct social scientist at the RAND Corporation. Now, the next part of Sean's bio is very important for our topic tonight, because he has a very unconventional background when it comes to being an academic. He worked in Africa for several years for DynCorp International, a company that provides international security services. There he created unique programs such as building Liberia's army from the ground up after its long civil war and Charles Taylor, the former president's exile. He trained Burundi's presidential guard to prevent a genocidal threat there in 2004. He's also worked on programs in South Sudan and Eastern Europe. From 1992 to 2000, he was a U.S. Army officer, serving as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. Following this, he was also an advisor to Amnesty International on human rights and armed conflict, and also a Bernard L. Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation. Dr. McFate holds a BA from Brown University, an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Sean McFate, who will discuss his book, Modern Mercenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much for taking time on a gorgeous day. So I feel very privileged because DC hasn't seen this in like 6 months, and we have this 3-week band of enjoyment before we lose it all. So thank you for being here, and it's a delight, Aaron, to be here. Thank you very much. So as Aaron was saying, the reason I wrote this book is I was actually in this industry, the private security or the private military industry, for some years. After being a paratrooper, I worked in DynCorp in Africa, doing all sorts of weird things. From helping prevent genocides in the Great Lakes regions to, in this case, doing the Victor Bout run from Eastern Europe to Africa, legally, might I add, to working with former warlords and trying to create security forces that are apolitical, professional, and responsible to the state, as we did in Liberia. The work that we did, I'm very proud of. And during this whole time period, a lot was being said in the news with a lot of left-wing and right-wing knee-jerk reactions about the private military industry or the private security industry. One of our colleagues here tonight is Doug Brooks, who's in the back, who during that time frame was the president of the International Stability Operations Association, which was a trade association. People don't realize this, but this industry had its own trade association in Washington, D.C. to represent its interests, just like any other trade association does. He did that. He was on watch during the Nisour Square incident, which some of you may remember. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But one of the reasons why there's so much said, yet so little known about this industry, is because it is so opaque. In my opinion, the industry is even more opaque than the military or the intelligence community. At least for like the CIA, you have oversight committees. You can ask your members of Congress about them. You can file what they call a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. If you do that with the private military industry, they will send you packing. They will say that this information is proprietary. And as a result, they don't have to disclose anything to you. And as a result, researchers, journalists, scholars have almost no access beyond just the simple, the corporate talk. And this is what has bred a lot of ignorance about what this industry can and cannot do. As a former industry insider who's no longer beholden to its interests, I felt a calling, if you will, to sort of describe it, but not in sort of like the cheap, like I tell all $1 million book, like this is what happened, and it's not that type of book at all. I wanted to write a three-dimensional book about the industry, where it has been, where it is today, and where it's going to be going in the future. And that's what this book's about. Okay, this book's about the past, present, and future. It's done in a rigorous manner, yet I tried to write it so it wouldn't be a snooze-a-thon in sort of academic, parlance. I tried to write it to be read. So I'm going to first talk about its past, its recent past, why we have it today. Why has private military force, which has been on hiatus for 3 centuries, suddenly reappearing now? Then I'm going to talk about its present, like today, not like present like during the Iraq War. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about where it might be leading world order. And I don't mean this in a sort of grandiose manner. I just really honestly mean global security governance. What does this mean? Okay, that's the plan for tonight. That'll take a lot of Q&A. All right. First of all, let's talk about the recent past, the last decade of war. In 2010, just during the height of the Iraq War, Afghanistan, over half of DoD's money was obligated to contracts. Over half. And that's just Department of Defense. I mean, Department of State also uses this industry as well, which is, to give you some scale and scope, that's 7 times the UK's whole budget for defense. Not an insignificant number. But when we talk about what this industry is, we have to think about it's not just, trigger pullers. When I ask people like, well, that's a lot of people for Blackwell, well, it's not mostly what these contractors are doing. Most of these contractors are doing things like base support, cooking food, repairing vehicles, doing communications, things that are non-lethal. There's still the things the military would have done, 30, 40 years ago, that are being contracted. Only about 10 to 15% of this industry actually does what we might consider to be military, sort of exclusively military things like trigger pulling or training people to pull triggers. I lump those two things together. Whether you're doing security work with firearms or you're raising militaries, it's the same thing, because if you can do one, you can do the other. And in my opinion, it's the same moral universe, the application of lethal force. It's not the same as repairing, a deuce and a half. So, in the world of contractors, only a minority here are armed or train others to be armed, all right? Just to be clear. Most contractors are completely sort of innocuous, if you will. All right, so again, only a small minority. But don't let numbers fool you. By the way, this is what I call, for me, the definition of the private military industry. These are expeditionary conflict entrepreneurs. These are not mall cops at the local mall doing sort of, standing by the Bank of America ATM. These are expeditionary companies who engage in security services in a military-like way. That kill or train others to kill. Again, for me, it's the same moral universe. If you can train others to kill, you can kill yourself. There should not be a bright line between those two things. So that's the private military industry. The companies engage, in my opinion, in a lot of euphemism. They like to call themselves, well, we're actually private security forces, or we're contingency contractors, or as Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, recently said, we're a logistics company. Well, that's, BS would be my Washingtonian response to that. DHL and FedEx are logistics companies. What you're probably doing, does anybody know what Eric Prince is doing now, by the way? Eric Prince is the founder of Blackwater. We all know Blackwater. What's Eric Prince doing? In the Middle East? Well, sort of in the Middle East. That's close. Yeah, he's kind of everywhere. He's ubiquitous. Frontier Services Group. And what do they do? Logistics. And thank you. Who employs him? China.
And China.
Yeah, China. He's working in Africa. He's being bankrolled largely by China, to my knowledge. And this is somebody who a couple years ago was flag waving, saying, hey, this industry, Blackwater, you know, we're all good Americans here. So this is one of the concerns people raise about this industry. We'll get to that later in Q&A. All right. But don't remember, so even though they're only a small minority of the workforce, they have a disproportional impact on strategic outcomes, especially when they fail. So we remember, speaking of Eric Prince, in Blackwater in 2007, Nisour Square. A Blackwater squad-size element kills 17 Iraqi civilians at a traffic circle in Baghdad. This causes a huge strategic problem for the United States of America. So bad that the Secretary of State had to apologize to the entire region for Blackwater's conduct and faced multiple inquiries in both the first and second branches of the United States government and lawsuits in the third branch of government. It is largely considered one of the nadirs or naders of the Iraq War. That and perhaps Abu Ghraib. So even though it's just 15% of the industry, that is what we would call the industry at its worst point. So it's not about numbers here, it's about impact. Now contractors are also paying the highest price too. Now the deaths of contractors is really hard to get at. Companies are not incentivized to publicize this information. It's sort of like a bank saying we were robbed of so much money this past quarter. And also the US government does not suck this information out of contractors, which is kind of hard to believe. And this is based on a study done at George Washington University, which itself has problems. But overall, I think the trend lines are accurate, that in the beginning of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, US soldiers were basically doing the dying, if you will, and this began to reverse over time, so that contractors were. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what kind of contractors? Remember that big pie chart of different types of contractors? Who do you think is getting hit the most here? What kind of contractors? Yeah.
Trading.
What?
Trading.
Training? Not so much, but there are a lot of training contractors were being killed, especially in Afghanistan in 2012. So much so that the U.S. mission had to shut down all training for a while because too many Afghan soldiers were shooting their contract and drill instructors, which, I mean, as a former military guy, I understand that, but I don't advocate that. Yeah.
The big jump is in 2004, so transportation, that's when
That's correct. So truck drivers were being hit the most. Truck drivers will, all right? And were truck drivers all Americans? Very few of them, right? So when we think about this industry, we only think about, oh, they're Americans. Blackwater's American, or I'm just going to pick on Blackwater a little bit. But that's not the case. The vast majority of this industry are not Americans at all. You see Americans in the middle and senior ranks, but most of them are from all over the world. These are multinational corporations. And so local workforce is probably the most. That's like drivers and translators and people, that's most of it. But they also have what they call third country nationals. These are TCNs. Third country nationals means that they're not US and they're not from, say, Iraq. So when I was working in DynCorp, I was working with third country nationals from every place from like Mexico to India to Ghana, doing all sorts of weird things. So you have a lot of third country nationals there too. All right, so contractors over time are doing more of paying the ultimate price, if you will. And there's an argument to be made that the U.S. is growing more dependent on the private sector to go to war. So in World War II, only about 10% of the sort of military workforce, if you will, was contracted. By Vietnam, it was around 25%. By the last decade of war, it was 50% or higher. So in Iraq, there was a 1-to-1 ratio of contractor to soldier. For every trooper, there was a contractor. And in Afghanistan, it was much higher. Much higher. And this leads some to ask this question. When I talk especially to foreign experts or foreign journalists, they ask me this: is the US moving to a contract warfare model? Which in Washington, D.C. is anathema that you'd think of that. But the numbers are pretty clear in recent years. Now, to be clear about that, I don't see the U.S. outsourcing, the 82nd Airborne Division. I think combat, hardcore combat sources will still always be done by the U.S. military, but logistics are everything else is increasingly becoming privatized. Others, though, do question this. And this creates all sorts of problems. Now, let's ask, why did this happen? How do we get to the point where 50% or 70% of the workforce is contracted, not even from the United States of America? These are people from all over the world fighting for U.S. wars for profit, or just to make a living, however you want to call it. The problem is that we have an all-volunteer armed forces, which we're very proud of. And the military likes for all sorts of disciplinary reasons and stuff. But that all-volunteer force is unable to sustain 2 long wars. It cannot get enough volunteers to do that, despite what Department of Defense, in my opinion, has said over the last 10 years. There's been all sorts of increases of bonuses and all sorts of things to keep people in the military. So policymakers early on in the Iraq War were faced with some difficult decisions. The first is, sort of avoid all messy conflicts in the future. Don't get involved, sort of isolationism. Arguably, this is not something a superpower can really afford to do. So that was out. The second is assume allies will fill all US gaps. Well, that would cause a chuckle in most DC audiences, so that's out. A reasonable chuckle too, right? Third, have a draft like Vietnam. In World War II, 10% of the force is contract because everybody else could be drafted, right? Well, that would be political suicide in 2004, which left people with, let's contract out the difference, which has been something done by both Republican and Democrat administrations. Senator Obama proposed some sort of regulation around this industry that President Obama seems to have not moved on. So that's how we are, sort of why we are with a military personnel workforce such as mostly contracted. But it's not all bad. There's a lot of utility to this industry. Without going to details, we can do this in Q&A. They are generally cheaper, just like renting a car is cheaper than owning one. They can do some things better. They are not beholden to bureaucratic turf wars. They do foster private sector innovation. And I could do things in Africa working for DynCorp that I would not be able to do working for the Department of Army. They are flexible. They do have surge capacity. They can do all sorts of good and interesting things. And they're arguably better at manipulating the global supply chain. Manipulating is the wrong verb. Using the global supply chain. But there's a lot of problems as well. First of all, there's ethical issues and issues about legitimacy. Second is that there is a conflict of interest between, public ends and private means. There are control and safety issues. How do you control, regulate, and safeguard an armed industry? There are moral hazard issues in terms of public policy too. In many ways, having this new tool in the toolbox of policymakers can tempt entrance into conflict. It lowers the barrier of entry into conflict. These companies have sort of built-in plausible deniability to some extent. The U.S. government or a government can hire a company to do things that, like, if it goes sort of off the reservation, it's not like having U.S. Marines do it. They can say, it's a terrible company. We'll never use them again. We'll wash our hands of them. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So it's a sort of a buffer layer. And again, this industry can be more opaque than using federal assets. Not always, but it can. So there are some risks to it as well. Let's leave that for Q&A if you want to discuss that. I want to move on to today. A decade of war, where has this left the world today with this new sort of private military industry? In the book, I identified 4 trends of where it's taking us. First is that the industry is not going to go away. The Department of Defense tends to has thought, in my opinion, of this industry as being like cheap Army reservists. That when the US is done with them, they will simply demobilize and fold back into civil society. That's wrong. These are profit maximizing institutions. They'll seek new clients, and that's what they're doing. The US has also legitimized this industry by using it for 10 years. So recently, this past year, Nigeria, does anybody recall what Nigeria did with mercenaries? They hired mercenaries to go after Boko Haram. Now, Nigeria is like is one of the strong. It's like the regional superpower of Western Africa, with the strongest military by far. And for 6 years, they could not defeat Boko Haram, and they hired mercenaries in this past spring. The mercenaries went in there and pushed them all into Chad. Terrible for Chad, right? But they were very effective. Now, is the U.S. really going to say, well, you can't use private military forces? That's bad, Nigeria. No, we have created the model to do so. We've legitimized them in a de facto sort of sense. And this is creating a free market for force, because now we're getting to this part of the world now where it's not just one super client like the U.S. in a monopoly. We have now a growing force where there's multiple clients and multiple suppliers. And it's too late to ban this industry. The second is that the industry is going native. So this is the Watan group in Afghanistan. These are indigenous private military companies. They're following the model of Blackwater and Armor Group and DynCorp and Triple Canopy. And in some cases, they're being hired by those companies as subcontractors or subs. And also, a lot of these people, these companies are global. They recruit people from all over the world. So what happens when a bunch of Ugandans are hired by a company to go to Iraq, and once that company's contract ends, they go back to Uganda? Guess what they do? They create their own Ugandan private military company, and they're in places like Somalia right now. So the industry is slowly creeping, going around the world. It's not just a US phenomenon in US wars. At the same time, it's also proliferating. There's new demand and there's new supply. So who's hiring these companies now? Well, extractive industry is. Like if you're a mining company or an oil company, you have no choice. You have to go where your asset is and you have to protect it. And a lot of these extractive industries are tired of relying on corrupt local police forces and local governments to safeguard their personnel and property, and they're turning to an industry which the US has created basically, or at least catapulted into maturity to some extent, to do it for them. You also have NGOs hiring them. You have really rich people hiring them. So for example, in 2008, I was called in as a pro bono consultant to weigh in on a situation where you had a very wealthy person who wanted to hire Blackwater to stage an international humanitarian intervention in Darfur to stop the genocide. And they wanted to know, and at the same time, there's an NGO who hired me. This rich person wanted to commission an NGO to name and shame the world into a more robust UN peacekeeping mission. And the plan was kind of this. It was sort of like, Blackwater is going to go in there and create islands of humanity to protect civilians against the genocidaires, who are the Janjaweed at that point. And meanwhile, this NGO is going to use its global clout and platform to do a global name and shame campaign, which this person was going to fund, to get the UN into a more robust position to protect civilians and stop a genocide in Darfur that everybody had agreed it was a genocide. And this NGO wanted to know, A, could Blackwater really do that? And B, should we do that? The short answer is yes, Blackwater could have done that. Maybe for days, maybe for a few weeks, but they could have done that. And B, should they do that? Well, it would roll back centuries of international law and norms to do it. At the end of the day, all parties agreed that we're not going to do it. It's too risky. Blackwater at that point also was trying to get in good standing with the U.S. government. The U.S. government, State Department went through the roof when they heard this. But I believe this is going to happen at some point. Somebody is going to do something with good intentions that could risk sucking the U.S. or others into a war in a place it does not want to be, or making matters worse. The law of unintended consequences. So we're also seeing new companies emerge from places like Africa, places like South Asia. And lastly, security can generate its own demand. Security can engage in racketeering. So this happened in the Middle Ages when mercenaries were very common. A mercenary army would show up to a walled city in Italy, like Siena, and say, give us 5,000 pounds of gold, or we will sack your city. And the city says, okay, we'll give you 5,000 pounds of gold. And then the mercenary troop leaves and they say, okay, we'll be back next month, right? It's a Tony Soprano model, right? So that's what security forces can do. I don't think this is going on right now, but there's evidence of that historically. All right, we've seen this proliferate across 4 out of the 5 domains of war. So in strategic studies, we have 5 domains of war. We see it in land, like private military companies. We see it in sea. We see private, like counter piracy or privateers already in the Gulf of Aden, Gulf of Guinea, Malacca Straits. And this is like having an arsenal ship in the middle of the Gulf. And on this would be armed contractors. And if you're a freighter or tanker going through this area, you would pay, and they would helicopter or boat over a squad who would sit on your ship, put concertina wire around it, put up machine guns, and wait for pirates to arrive and shoot them if they had to. And then once you went through pirated waters, they would take the armed contractors back to the mothership, the arsenal ship. And this is kind of picking up. And it was part of the reason why we don't have piracy anymore in the Gulf of Aden. Part of it. The center of this, by the way, is London. London is where that's going on. Private air forces. Okay, we're not seeing any armed drones. We've seen the industry looking at drones. You could cheaply make a kamikaze drone. That wouldn't be very hard. Private space. Okay, so we don't have any privatized military space flight, but we're seeing privatized space flight. So it's conceivable, but I'm not saying it's going to happen. And lastly, cyberspace, the 5th domain of war. There are mercenaries in cyberspace. They're called hackback companies. What a hackback company is that just say you're an insurance company, and we'll say you're like McFate Insurance Company, and you saw this other insurance company next to Bob's Insurance Company just get hacked, and all the records were stolen. And that's really bad if you're an insurance company, right? Nobody wants that to happen. So right now, under current US law, the only thing you can do in cyberspace is play defense. You can't play offense. And the cyber threats are evolving too rapidly for like the NSA to go after every cyber hacker out there. So what you might consider doing is hiring what they call a hackback company. These are hackers who are offshore, and if somebody hacks you, they go after the hackers. Now, they can't recover the data that was been stolen. But the question is, can this cause a deterrent effect? Like if you're a Russian or some other hacker, and you know that company A has hackback and company B has nothing, you're going to probably go for company B. Now, that's the theory. Whether it works or not, that's questionable. Okay, but there is some grumbling about from private sector in this country that we need to have some more robust capacity for offense. All right, back to trends. Last trend, and that is industry bifurcation. The industry is currently at a crossroad between 2 different types of market actors. First are mercenaries. This is exactly what you think they are. Mercenaries are like for-profit warriors who will work for the highest bidder. And they engage in offensive, they're like autonomous military units. Military enterprisers, a term that comes from the 30 Years' War, is not. This is more like DynCorp and Blackwater. What military enterprisers do is that they can create forces, they can raise armies, and they can augment other armies, but they don't sort of have autonomous armies of their own. So they can raise militaries, they can augment militaries, but they are not independent militaries. And that's what the US used in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mercenaries is arguably what Nigeria used against Boko Haram. It's been said that Putin is using them in eastern Ukraine, parts of the Middle East, around Syria and Iraq potentially. Those are mercenaries. Now these are very different actors in some ways. So just briefly here. So services, again, mercenaries are autonomous military, they're like private armies. Enterprisers are not. Mercenaries kind of work for anybody. Military enterprisers generally work for governments, at least right now and historically they've worked for governments. And the working relationship is that mercenaries are pretty polygamous. They'll go where they're asked. And whereas military enterprisers really want a monogamous public-private partnership. They want a steady, reliable partner. And arguably, their clients want a steady, reliable private security firm. They don't want rogues, So there's some mutual attraction there. Market type. Mercenaries, it will create a free market for force, whereas this will be, enterprises call what I call a mediated market, where the private military company who is an enterpriser needs to obey the laws of their client. They can be pressured by their client and the client's market power. Whereas mercenaries are really just free agents. They're free agents. So examples in modern times, mercenaries, executive outcomes. A very powerful corporate mercenary firm that came out of South Africa in the 1990s after apartheid. It's now defunct. It closed its doors in the late 1990s, but it still has, if you will, an alumni network all through Africa, which I used to know. And that's largely what's behind the mercenaries Nigeria hired to go after Boko Haram. Whereas military enterprisers are, again, like Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp. But don't be fooled. We have a question right now, like which way is the market going to go? Left on autopilot, we're going to see more mercenaries. If we do something, maybe be more military enterprisers. However, the caveat is this. If you can be one, you can be the other. If you have the skill set to be a military enterpriser, you have the skill set to be a mercenary. It's largely dictated by the client or by market forces or whatever. So these are really in some ways the same animal. All right, now let me conclude with where this is taking us. What is a world where this is left on autopilot? What would it look like? Well, it can impact world order. Without getting too into international relations and political science theory here, first of all, this is not a new phenomenon. Private military force is the history, private military history is largely privatized. Roman Empire, Pharaoh, everybody, it's the second oldest profession in the world. We shouldn't be shocked, oh my goodness, private military warriors, this is not new. This is new to our modern ears, but it's quite common to everybody else. So mercenary warfare, in fact, in the European Middle Ages was routine. That's how you fought wars, because standing armies were too expensive. All right, and so this is the mercenaries, but mercenaries were not like these cutthroats that Machiavelli tells us about. Machiavelli was terribly burned by his mercenaries, and he was a secdef of Florence in 1500 and 1506. So he's a little bitter. We can talk about that. He's a bitter man. But they're not all bad. For example, his hometown of Florence, 100 years before him, had Sir John Hawkwood, an English mercenary captain, one of the most famous men of his ilk, who served Florence loyally for 17 years until he died of natural causes. They liked him so much they actually have I don't know what the word is, in their Duomo, they have like a little shrine for him. There's a word for it. I don't know what it is. My the Pope's in town soon, so I should know all this, but I don't. So even speaking of that, popes hired mercenaries. Pope Innocent III especially. Anybody wanted to raise an army, no problem, let's go to the market. Go to the eBay of mercenaries. And they weren't called mercenaries, they were called condottieri, which means contractor in Italian, just like we call them today. And these contractors formed multinational corporations, not like today's with the SEC and the 10K statement, but these were companies. They were called companies. They were largely multinational. You join a company, it could be small, 10 people, it could be large, 10,000 people. And you could be with warriors from Spain, Scotland, Syria, all over the Mediterranean would be fighting along, and you would get a contract, and each contract was different. It would say like, if on sacking a city, you get such percentage of spoils. You'd have a booty clause. Or you get compensation if you lost a horse or an arm or something like that. So these were called contractors. And using them was really no different than hiring contractors to dig a moat or to paint your family's portrait. It was just another commodity on the marketplace. Now this created a market for force, a free market for force, that sort of contributed to what I call durable disorder. And this is the concern as to where this is leading, is that when you have a world where anybody who has the means to afford war can wage it for whatever reason they want, politics will fundamentally change, right? So durable disorder, describes a world order that can contain but not solve problems. And arguably, in my book, I argue this is what we've been seeing since the end of the Cold War. So I'll give you 6 features of it, quickly. The first is that there will be a shift in global power. Again, anyone who has wealth, who can afford war, can wage it for any reason they want. In the Middle Ages, you could wage war because somebody didn't look at you the right way, because you just felt like it, because you wanted to steal what they had, because whatever. That will happen. Right now, war is the prerogative of states. And that's violated in different ways, but we're starting to see that prerogative unwind in the last 25 years. This will see new superpowers where the ultra wealthy can become a superpower. Is it possible that an oligarch or a corporation can have its own army, and what will that do? Now, I don't want to get into like what happens when ExxonMobil has its own army, but you could see that happening in 50 years, or companies like Exxon, I don't say Exxon, but companies like ExxonMobil, or super wealthy people. You'll see more mercenaries as a result. Demand attracts supply, and there is a wealth of supply in the world. People go to places like Iraq to sort of learn the craft. They go to places like Syria to learn the craft. Arguably, the Gulf states have been sort of hiring people to go fight Assad in Syria. And it's sort of transactional. Are they mercenaries? Are they not? It's a good question. But where do they go when the war is done? This is the classic problem for mercenaries. This will create more war. A world awash in mercenaries creates more war. Because if you put an industry invested in conflict into the most conflict-prone places in the planet, they will find ways to create war, expand war, or widen it, or elongate it for profit. They don't want to work themselves out of a job. And you saw this in the Middle Ages. Again, a good case study for this. Like the Middle Ages, this creates contract warfare. It's like contract killing, but it's war. It's bigger. You can hire a mercenary. And the logic of the marketplace now applies to military strategy. So just say we're here, give ourselves a name give us an army name. Okay, well, all right, okay, so just say we're the 16th Street, we own 16th Street, right? All right, just whatever, and we don't like those people in Farragut Square. So what we're gonna do we have a lot of money because we 16th Street, right? This is we are going to and neither of us it's like the Middle Ages. Neither of us have strong standing armies. We're going to invade them. Before we do that and take Farragut Square, which is our square, we're going to rename it 16th Street Square. We're going to buy up every mercenary outfit in the neighborhood to deny them a defense, just like Wall Street does. And we hang up law firms, the PR firms. But what the Farragut Square tribe clan does is they say, okay, we have no defense, but we're going to bribe half of your people not to show up on game day. So again, the logic of the marketplace now applies to military strategy. And incidentally, that's kind of what happened to Machiavelli in the wars against Pisa in 1500 to 1506, is that Florence was a much bigger power than Pisa, but Pisa bought out half of their mercenaries, bribed them out, which made Machiavelli loathsome. Okay, so contract warfare, new type of warfare, new type of strategies. And lastly, this, and the book gets into this, creates what I call neo-medievalism. Now neo-medievalism is not like the Knights of Ni, all right? This is not Monty Python and killer rabbits and, God bless them. This is a world order that's vastly different than our own. This is a world order where states are not privileged. That there is nobody who's privileged. It's a world stage that's now crowded. Right now, it's just only states can sort of be on there. But in the Middle Ages, just like today, increasingly today, we're seeing new types of actors become political. We're seeing multinational corporations. The Fortune 500 is certainly more powerful than most of the 192 states out there. You're seeing the power of NGOs, international organizations, super wealthy individuals. Back in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, the Pope, coming here soon, was a superpower. He was a superpower. And we're seeing this increasingly now. And this creates overlapping sovereignty, overlapping claims of authority. So that if you're like a peasant, let's say you're back in Farragut Square, you're a peasant because it's terrible over there. You have multiple, it's the Middle Ages, you have multiple bosses, right? You have the local prince who says, you owe me tax. And you have the local church that says, no, you owe the church a tithe. And then the bishop comes along and says, no, forget whatever the king said, you must listen to me, you're going to go to hell. And the king's like, no, don't listen to the bishop, you obey my laws. And this goes up to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. I mean, you have multiple claims on your authority. The only thing you're clear on is that you can't leave your land. You're bound to your land as a serf. And so we get to the point where people have multiple identities. And this describes much of the world today. So if you're in Afghanistan, do you see yourself as Afghan first and only? No, you may be Pashtuni first. Or actually, maybe you're from some certain district first, then you're Pashtuni, then you're Afghanistan. I mean, there's multiple levels of identity, of political identity. And so this is a world that's totally, we're basically going back to the status quo ante of Westphalia following the end of the Cold War, more or less. And that this is not a regression, this is not the sky is falling, invest in more sky, which is the way that a lot of political scientists approach it. This is just returning to the norm. It's states being the center of global politics is an aberration. It's not the rule. If you look at the scope of history, states are not universally historic. They had a beginning, they have a middle, and they may have an end. Now, I'm not saying the state's going to go away. It's going to be Mad Max at Thunderdome. I'm just saying that the devolution of state authority, which we call the Balkanization of things, we're seeing this occur in the Middle East right now. We're seeing it occur in South Asia. It's has always been occurred in Africa. This is the return to normal. So, private military force is sort of just one more emblem in that sort of trajectory. So with that, I leave you. You can read more about it in the book, and I look forward to entertaining any questions you might have.
Take about 20 minutes of questions, up to 20 minutes.
Okay, up to 20 minutes of questions, yeah.
Rather than use warfare, use intelligence.
Yes.
Contract intelligence.
Yes.
The majority of people want stability.
Yeah.
Unmanned systems are mainly intelligence devices.
Yes.
So if the intelligence community gains leverage
Mm-hmm.
with the private sector over intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
we will have more stability than if it goes in your direction.
Say the last again, the if
Have
then?
more stability if
But-
the warfare machine gets unmanned systems in the UN,
Yeah.
gets mass unmanned systems where they'll lose them to the terrorists.
Uh-huh.
We will have the world that Peter Singer wrote about called Wired for War, with
Sure.
total instability.
Right.
But we can intentionally stop that.
Right. Well, first of all, the intelligence community is following this trend of privatization. We all know that from Washington that analysis has long been privatized, is increasingly privatized, but that the collection is now increasingly privatized too. Not to the degree of the military, where 54% of the budget goes to contractors, but this is a worry for some. And this also creates problems like, arguably like Snowden and stuff like that. And automation is its own sort of concern. I think we're going to see this, the private military world, is that, machines are cheaper. You can buy a drone. It doesn't be the Reaper. You can buy stuff, probably off of Amazon. You can fly around. You can make it into a cheap kamikaze. You can have 30 of those, and they can dive bomb the president. I shouldn't have said that. Something like that.
2 weeks ago, they called me
Okay,
about that.
they did.
It was false.
Oh, okay.
But you can get a Gatling gun to 8,000 rounds a minute with plastic bullets, never kill a soul.
Right.
On the top of embassies, not just out all the stop all sorts.
Well, okay. Well,
So we have to get on the response side of the equation, not
Yeah.
the collection side.
yeah. So, but I do see this trend emerging in the intelligence community. Mark Mazzetti, a New York Times reporter, has actually done some good working on this. I hear in the back there's some disagreement on this, but I think that this is a trend we're seeing occur, the privatization of the intelligence community as well. Yes, question.
I have a question about the NGOs because I guess a South American ambassador, I won't say the name, was telling me about the Haiti issue with an NGO I won't name, but we'll hear more about it on their emails. So this NGO did this privatization, and it turned out to be a total disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm looking at that in reference to war, because this is a humanitarian crisis, and then I was looking at the refugee situation in, I believe it was Kurdistan, because I was actually talked to about a job in Kurdistan dealing with refugees before ISIL ever even happened. They were preparing for this onslaught.
Yep.
And then it turned out they found out through intelligence sources that Saddam's daughter helped fund it. And what happens with this, with these things that get out and then they're put on blogs and things like that it's in the public domain, and then people lose control. And when I look at your 6 factors of you've got companies like, I guess, Tony Hayward was the chairman of BP,
Yep.
the beach thing, and then he owned Janelle, and he bought real estate in Kurdistan. And it turned out that some of his money now, they found out was used to fund ISIS. So when you start looking at these things, we've created this chaos,
Yep.
right? And so how do we pull back? Because like you say, once you go into war, and it's about oil contracts, and now these people are getting these contracts. How do you stop this runaway train? It seems like there's a runaway train. How do we stop it? Because this ISIS thing was supposed to be a quick thing. It's not a quick thing. And it's a lot bigger than anybody ever thought it could be, because there's this emotional thing, right? So you get these mercenaries that came in that might have started it, but then the people got on board with the mercenaries. And that's what happened.
Well-
so I'm just curious what your thought is.
Well, there's a lot in that comment to unpack, but in general, I think that NGOs, getting to your original point, have looked at this industry with a lot of trepidation because no NGO wants to be hiring Blackwater, but they have this moral conundrum because if they have people threatened in a place like Somalia and nobody's to protect the people, they can either pull out of Somalia, meaning that they provide zero services to actual people in need, or they hire a private military company to protect their people, but they can then go on and service the local community. And this is a difficult choice, especially since NGOs, in many ways, they live and die literally on reputation and normative value. And this is partly why the United Nations won't right now overtly look at using the private military companies to augment peacekeeping forces. when there's a really strong argument that they should, because peacekeeping forces are getting thinner each year, and the demand for them are increasing, and there's a lot of good and a lot of utility under the right sort of regulatory circumstances that the industry can provide. But there's a normative question here, because are we fostering a longer term problem by hiring private security forces? Okay, well, yeah. Yes, and then we'll go around this way. Yep.
A bit
Yes.
deliberately provocative.
Okay, good.
And that is, I really enjoyed your talk first, and I can't wait to read the book. And there are ways to use these resources wisely, efficiently, effectively. We saw that. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you look at the losses that, for example, Blackwater sustained in terms of the individuals, the high-value individuals they were protecting, it was zero. And yet the numbers of casualties they were sustaining were high. So these were highly trained U.S. Special Forces individuals who had gotten out of the service and gone to work for Blackwater. They were making about $300K when they left the service. And what you saw over time, year by year, is less trained individuals being hired as the war went on, and making less and less and less, right? And so you saw this decrease in the skill set of the individuals that Blackwater and other Triple Candy and others were hiring. But there is a way to do it right. It just seems to me that we had a discomfort in our convenience of contracting, and that the first time something went wrong, we decided to kind of throw them over the bridge. And so we had individuals who were patriotic, had served their country, had, really were the best of the best, sort of people, and they felt betrayed by their own country when the first, thing went south. So if there was a way kind of to develop a better relationship with, the modern mercenary, so that, as you said, there's this tipping point. We can decide the future of where this goes. What can we do? What are your thoughts?
Well,
what can we do to make that relationship better?
So that was not nearly provocative enough, but I will continue that. I totally agree with that, and I wrote the book for this because I see a lot of good the industry can do, and I talk about it. So there's the Jeremy Scahills of the world, who just it's the world's falling, it's going to be a military, paramilitary coup d'etat any day here with Blackwater taking over the White House, right? And then there's other people who are we're just logistics people. Don't make it big. I think they're both wrong. There's a lot of utility, and I try to get at that in this book. And I have two case studies. One a good example, and one a not so good example, to show this. And I make the case at the end that the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations should seriously consider turning towards this industry, with a couple of key provisos, they need to regulate it. A couple of things the obvious, right? It's not like an auction block. And I think that is a way, and also because we can't turn back time and go back to thinking it's 1980 and these things don't exist, or they're totally underground in the Congo or something like that. These are now publicly traded, the New York Stock Exchange and stuff. So that's what I think. Now let me be provocative, because I was hoping you'd say this, but you didn't. So to your point that the world, everybody knows Nisour Square, right? How many people know Haditha? Anybody? Haditha? Okay. Well, Nisour Square, a couple five Blackwater guards shot 17 people, And not to defend them, but it was like a fog of war incident, right? They were in a traffic circle, they had split seconds to make a decision. They saw a car coming that matched the threat profile. It's like, choose. There's no time to have a seminar or do due diligence on that car. Now, in Haditha, in 2005 in Iraq, a squad of Marines killed 23 civilians, not in fog of war, but in a retribution revenge killing like My Lai in Vietnam. Their victims were 3-year-olds to old men in wheelchairs, in their pajamas. There's no threat, and this went on for hours. Did the world hear about Haditha? No. Was there like all the congressional hand-wringing, and was there like the sex state apologizing to the region? No. The Department of Defense had an internal investigation. They concluded that these unfortunate incidences were just a tragic example of an unscrupulous enemy. They blamed Al-Qaeda for the Marines' actions, and they were all let go. The same fate until recently as Blackwater. But nobody seems to mind if Marines commit human rights violations. It's just when private sector does it. So I think the hypocrisy of that is quite astounding.
Well, and it's better to be, judged by 12 than carried by 6, right? And I like the way that you identify that you have, sometimes it's less than a second to identify,
Yeah.
Whether it's a threat, and it's you or them.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. And it's not a judgment made lightly. These individuals are not out there to kill people.
Yeah, I'm also not excusing the Blackwater guards either. I'm just saying.
Right, and they don't excuse themselves
Right.
either. So I think that as long as everything's going well, everybody's happy. But the minute that something goes bad,
Yeah.
it's easy to.
All right, I take two comments here, and then we'll go another round. Yeah.
So in your book,
Yeah.
you make a big deal out of the deconstruction of the Westphalian
I do.
agreement and the mindset, the Westphalian mindset phase. And
Yes.
in Western nations, you really minimize it here
Mm-hmm.
in your presentation.
I could do another hour, but I won't. Yes.
Okay. So in your thinking about this, 10 years out, 20 years out, as this neo-medievalism progresses,
Mhm.
rolls across the globe, what do you think the world looks like?
I love that question. Let me get this gentleman's question. I'll answer both. Do you have a?
Yeah, actually, kind of goes right into that. So, in the PowerPoint, you talk about specifically the recent past. But in your presentation, you say that it's the second oldest profession,
Yes.
and you go back into a deeper past than just the recent last 10 to 15 years. So pretty much what my question is, in your book, you do a historical analysis of this industry throughout time, or you say, I don't have time to do that, so I'm going to focus on the recent past. And then, back to your question, do you show the Westphalian system in that greater arch, the trend?
Yeah.
And say, the Westphalian system was established for a particular reason.
Right.
And we're starting to see it go away.
Right. Okay, so those are two really great questions. Now, in the book, I do a deep dive on international relations theory and history and the theory of its history. And my influences are Chuck Tilley and Mansur Olson. So I look at the future and saying, like, the devolution of state authority and centralized authority across the Middle East, where people are like frantically running around, like, what's going to happen to Syria? What's going to happen to Iraq? I'm like, calm down. This is the way it's always been, actually. I see the future as being more messy. I look at Africa, because Africa never quite ever saw the centralized state. Maybe in North Africa, but Sub-Saharan Africa never quite did. I mean, there's the Zimbabwe Empire. There's been empires. Empires are not the same thing as states. A state is a type of political organization. It doesn't describe every type of political organization. A tribe is not a state. And unlike some American political scientists, I don't believe there's an evolution of you start with a tribe and you end up with a state. I think they're all in the same bottom for the most part. And I think the world that we'll see will be, this is an overused word, but it'll be more complicated because authority will be sort of like pushed down and decentralized. We already see this from much of the world. And I have like students with Aaron at the National Defense University who come from all parts of the world, and they hear us talk about, the state, and to them, they're like, what is this? And they see it as it started in Western Europe and was made global by colonization in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And then 19th century and 20th century, it was reified into literature as real, into scholarship. And if you actually read the treaties of Westphalia, of Munster and Osnabrück, there's nothing at all about this Westphalian system. It's all fiction. That thing is nothing but a ceasefire. That's all it is. And now you can read into it this like glorious state system, but I challenge anybody to find it there. It's like trying to find it in Narnia. It doesn't exist. So we have political scientists in the American and Western European tradition inherit this belief system that I challenge. And if you look around us, we're simply reverting, to your question, we're reverting back to what the world looked like before the 1600s, where political authority was diluted. And there was overlapping claims of authority and overlapping claims for allegiance. And that made a very messy world, especially when conflict was commoditized. And that's what's the kicker, because once you have the power to compel people to your will on pain of death, politics turns. And that's going to change global order, which is right now based on state centricity. Okay, 2 questions in the back. Go to the gentleman here and then go to Doug. Yeah.
You looked into how the insurance industry plays into this. Do insurance companies like security forces? Do they dislike them? Are they a risk to them, or are there preferred providers? Do you think that the insurance companies may eventually turn to having their own for, like, the way that they currently employ lawyers?
It's a good question. And Doug.
That's a great question.
Yes.
So the industry, the Swiss government and the industry and the international community put together the Montreux document.
Yes.
Which sort of made some guidelines for the industry.
Yeah.
And subsequently, the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers.
Yeah.
And the International Code of Conduct Association, and then also the PSC1 International Standard for
Yep.
security companies. And you've been quite dismissive of these
Yeah.
in the past. I wonder if you could elaborate on more.
Sure. Okay. Both really good, hard questions. So to answer the insurance world, I am not an expert in the global insurance world any more than I'm also a question about like law, not international law, not international public law, but sort of like the commercial aspects. To my knowledge, I think the industry would like to create a certification to Doug's point, where the industry can present to the insurance world or whomever, saying like, here's a list of certified gold-plated providers that we vouch for, and this is what they've had to do to earn this blue ribbon status. You should use them, and I think there's an argument for that. Okay, to what extent did do insurance do shipping lines get some sort of insurance discount because they're using or not using private navies, if you will? That's a great question. I don't have the answer to it. There are people who are studying this in maritime, and I think if you read the book, I'm pretty optimistic. I would sort of hope that would be the case. A, because the industry's not going to go away, and B, this is a way to have a mediated market rather than just a free market. Now, Doug raises some very good questions. The industry in the last 10 years, even a little longer, has been working with some governments and some NGOs to create sort of a rules of the road, which is a great idea. And initially, I was part of the Montreux, in Montreux in Switzerland, process, but the reason I am skeptical about this is that I think it's a good beginning, but not a sufficient ending. There's no teeth to this. This is a voluntary code, and it relies on self-reporting of crime. Now, I just don't think a private company is going to say, oh yeah, we just chopped off 17 orphan heads in some western Nigerian town, or we're so sorry. Discipline us, please. I just don't see this as realistic. And when you ask, there's any sort of, the worst thing that could happen in these organizations that you get kicked out of the club. Is there something else can you have assets frozen? Can you be what can happen to a human rights violation?
Well, not self-reporting. Anybody
Okay.
And they just deal with it, and it goes not just to the companies, but to the NGOs and the government. So there's criminal aspects to it that's handled through criminal courts, and the Montreal document says which courts handle it.
How do you do that in a field of battle, though?
That's it. So the Montreal document says, okay, it's either going to be the country where the incident takes place, the country of origin of the company, or the country where the individual is from. But one of them is responsible to handle the court case, and just clarifies that. Now, on the larger aspect, if a company allows this to happen,